Is Will Byers the most tragic character in Stranger Things because of the interdimensional kidnapping, the possession, and the bowl cut that defies the laws of physics? Or is it because he's the only one smart enough to realize how truly screwed they all are? Stay tuned. Today on Side vs. Side, we're talking about Will Byers, the boy who lived, zombie boy, the kid who can't catch a break. Now, we're going to have spoilers for seasons 1 through 4. No, that's season 5. Not yet. Spoilers for seasons 1 through 4. So if you aren't caught up, you should maybe be aware of that. Now, you might think any video about Will is just going to be about trauma. And sure, the kid has seen some things, but I think something weirder is going on here. If you actually look at the data, how he survives, how he solves problems, and how he suffers, Will isn't just a victim. He's a textbook case of high-level intellectual giftedness. And I don't mean gets good grades smart. I mean neurodiverse operating system that processes reality differently smart. Here's the thing, though. Most of us value being smart, right? So pointing out problems with people with intellectual giftedness sounds like complaining about having too much money. Oh no, I feel so bad for you. Social isolation, existential depression in elementary school, the constant pressure to hide who you are just to fit in. Sound familiar? So let's dive into the untold dangers of being the smart kid. Okay, so how do we know how smart Will is? Well, first we have to define smart, because in psychology, it's not just one thing. It's a whole messy soup of abilities. If you've seen our videos on intelligence, you'll probably be familiar with G, which stands for general intelligence. The idea behind G is that people might be good at one thing or another and might test high in one specific area. But people with high G will test high in all of the areas. So traditionally, what intelligence tests do is they give a test over a bunch of different kinds of skills, and that allows you to separate the overall intelligence from just being good at one certain thing. Now, the cool thing about G is that it really is good at predicting all kinds of things that we care about. Job performance, academic achievement, income, and, thanks to the emerging field of cognitive epidemiology, even physical health and longevity. But sometimes people with a high G might struggle in a specific area, and in these cases where you have to diagnose an issue, it can be helpful to break G down into some smaller, more specific abilities. The gold standard for this is something called the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory, or CHC for short. And honestly, you can think of that like a D&D character sheet that makes up your overall intelligence, with different points in each area. At the top, you've got G, general intelligence, the thing that all the different types of smarts have in common. But underneath that, you've got all these specialized abilities. Fluid reasoning, or GF, this is your ability to solve problems you've never seen before. It's not, I studied for this. It's, I'm currently being hunted by a flower-faced monster in a toxic shadow dimension. How do I not die? It's pattern recognition, logic, adapting on the fly. When you're dropped into a situation where there is no manual, fluid reasoning is what keeps you alive. Visual spatial processing, GV, is thinking in 3D, mentally rotating objects, understanding how things relate to each other in space. It's why some people can look at IKEA instructions and immediately know what goes where, while others cannot. GWM refers to your working memory ability, your ability to hold information in your head and manipulate it. It's kind of like your brain's RAM. It's how many things can you keep track of at once while also doing something with all that information. GS is processing speed. How fast can you perform automatic cognitive tasks, especially under pressure? When every second counts, this is what determines if you make the right call or you freeze up. And then we have crystallized intelligence, all of the stuff you've learned. This is your database, your long-term memory of knowledge. For Will and his friends, that's heavily populated by Dungeons & Dragons lore, which turns out to be weirdly useful when you're fighting literal monsters. All of these abilities correlate with G, though it's pretty well established that fluid reasoning is the closest to measuring G directly. Most people are average across the board. Mike Wheeler, Dustin, Lucas, they all might excel in an area or two, and they might be even above average, but not really exceptional. But Will is running a custom CPU that overclocks everything. His character sheet is min-maxed for survival in impossible situations. And some people, somewhere between 2 and 5% of the population, have this kind of cognitive profile that's just different. Way higher than the average across multiple domains. And that's what psychologists call giftedness. Let's look at the receipts, because this isn't just a fan theory, this is observable cognitive performance under extreme conditions. So let me present to you Exhibit A, the Christmas lights. Will is trapped in a dimension where sound doesn't carry to our world, but electromagnetic energy does. He figures this out, alone, while starving, while being hunted. He then engineers a communication interface using Christmas lights to spell out RUN. I want you to appreciate the cognitive load here. He can't see the painted letters on the wall in his dimension. The upside down doesn't update with new paint. He has to spatially estimate where Joyce painted the R, map it to the corresponding bulb in his memory, and trigger it. That is not a normal 12-year-old. That's an electrical engineer operating on pure adrenaline and fluid reasoning under extreme cognitive load. No textbook for this, no practice run, just here's an impossible problem, solve it or die. Exhibit B, the map. In Season 2, Will draws the tunnel system, hundreds of pages, non-linear scribbles. When Joyce tapes them together, they form a perfect to-scale map of the underground network. Do you know how hard that is? That's eidetic visual reconstruction. He's taking a massive 3D environment he saw in fragmented visions, breaking it down into 2D tiles in his head, and drawing them out of order such that they could fit them together perfectly later. And from a psychometric perspective, this is savant-level visual spatial processing. He's holding multiple 3D representations in his mind simultaneously, rotating them, translating them onto 2D surfaces, and maintaining perfect spatial relationships across dozens of separate drawings. Oh, and he's doing this while being psychologically tortured by an interdimensional entity. Let's take Exhibit C, Morse code. He's tied to a chair. He's being burned alive. He's literally possessed by an ancient evil entity. And he manages to tap out a coherent message in Morse code without the Mind Flayer noticing. Let's be clear about what's happening here. Will is simultaneously being burned alive, the Mind Flayer doesn't like heat, possessed by a hostile intelligence, and still managing to retrieve Morse code from memory, formulate a message, and execute precise motor commands to communicate it. That is a feat of working memory and inhibition control that is frankly terrifying. He's splitting his consciousness. Part of him is screaming in agony, part of him is hiding from the monster inside his own head, and part of him is acting like a telegraph operator. That's processing speed and working memory, operating under conditions that would cause most people's brains to just shut down. So the verdict is, Will is a genius, a wizard class, high intelligence. What we're seeing across all of these examples is a kid who doesn't just have high intelligence in one area, he's got this rare integration of multiple cognitive domains all running at a high level simultaneously. This isn't just smart kid does well in school. This is cognitive profile that shows up in maybe 1 to 2% of the population. So that leaves the question, why is he so miserable? Now, if you've been watching Sci vs. Sci for a while, you know we don't just accept the standard narrative at face value. And we usually think of high intelligence as a buff, a bonus, +2 to life success. But here's where we challenge the textbook. And the standard narrative about giftedness is, oh, isn't it great to be smart? You do well in school, you get into a good college, have a successful career. It's presented as pure upside. But there's a whole body of research that tells a very different story. A Polish psychologist named Kazimierz Dąbrowski studied this extensively and called it the tragic gift. He identified something called overexcitabilities, or OEs, that basically it's the gifted nervous systems react more intensely to stimuli. It's not just that you're smarter, it's that you feel everything more intensely. And there are 5 types that have been identified so far. The first is intellectual OE. You can't stop asking why. It's almost a compulsive need to understand things, to question, to analyze. You can't accept, oh, because I said so. Imaginational OE. You have vivid, sometimes intrusive internal worlds, mental imagery that's as real as the outer world, the ability to envision how things could be instead of just how they are. Emotional overexcitability is where you don't just feel sad, you feel the crushing weight of the world's entropy. Feelings that are deeper and more intense than normal. Physical responses to emotion. Your stomach hurts when you're anxious. You flush when you're embarrassed. Strong attachments to people, places, and things. Then there's psychomotor overexcitability. Surplus energy, need for movement, heightened physical responsiveness. And sensual overexcitability, heightened experience of sensory pleasure or displeasure. Now, on the one hand, these overexcitabilities are what allow gifted people to create amazing art, solve impossible problems, and push humanity forward. On the other hand, Dabrowski literally called it a tragic gift, because those same overexcitabilities make you vulnerable to crushing existential depression and social isolation. Here's where it gets disturbing. Dąbrowski argued that because gifted kids have the hardware to process complex information, they also process complex existential problems way before they're emotionally ready. Picture this. You're 10 years old and you're lying in bed at night thinking, why do I exist? What's the point anyway? We're all going to die anyway. The universe is vast and indifferent, and my life is statistically meaningless. Is this all there is? Some would call that existential depression, and it's shockingly common in gifted children. Why? Because gifted kids can grasp abstract concepts like mortality, meaninglessness, and cosmic insignificance before they have the emotional maturity to cope with it. They have the intellectual capacity to ask the big questions the philosophers wrestle with, but not the life experience to find answers that satisfy them. While Mike and Lucas are worrying about romance and arcade scores, Will is worrying about the permanence of loss and the inevitability of change. And when they try to talk to their peers or even adults about this, they get shut down. Don't be so serious. You think too much. Just have fun and be a kid. So they learn to stop talking about it. They learn that their actual inner life is unacceptable. And they learn to be alone with their thoughts. So let's talk about the stigma of being gifted. This brings us to researchers Coleman and Cross, who in the 1980s identified something they called the stigma of giftedness. They found that gifted adolescents are acutely aware of being different, intellectually, emotionally, creatively, and that violates the egalitarian norms of their peer groups. And in the brutally conformist environment of middle school and high school, being different gets you punished. Smart kids realize very quickly that being intense makes them weird. It violates the social norm. So gifted kids face a choice, what Coleman and Cross called a forced choice dilemma. Be yourself, pursue your actual interests, use your full vocabulary, engage with complex ideas, and risk social rejection, or hide who you are, dumb yourself down, pretend to care about things you don't, suppress your curiosity, and maybe you get to have friends. Will chooses option 2. He tries to be normal. He tries to just play D&D and fit in, but he can't. Most gifted kids choose option 2. They engage in what's called information management, actively monitoring and controlling what they reveal about themselves to avoid standing out. And here's the really messed up part. Coleman and Cross found that the stigma doesn't even have to be real to be damaging. If a kid just assumes they'll be rejected for being smart, they'll preemptively shrink themselves. They'll build a protective mask and wear it so consistently that they forget what their actual face looks like. You want to know how bad it gets? A researcher named Miraka Gross looked specifically at students with IQs of 160 plus, the extremely gifted. She found that 80% of these kids reported experiencing intense social isolation in regular classrooms. They said they were continuously monitoring their social behavior to conform to the expectations of their peer group. So that's 4 out of 5 extremely gifted kids spending their entire school day performing a version of themselves that isn't real, just to avoid being completely alone. Now this leads to something called the social isolation feedback loop. And here's how that tends to play out. First, the gifted kid realizes they're different. Then they try to connect with peers, but conversations feel shallow. They either get rejected for being weird, or they choose to hide to avoid rejection. This leads to increasing feelings of isolation. Out of that loneliness, they develop an intense inner life as compensation. This inner life becomes richer than the external social world, and soon they have even less in common with their peers, completing a loop in which isolation intensifies and it cycles on and on. And the research shows this gets worse during adolescence when the pressure to conform is at its peak and the consequences of being other are most brutal. Studies have found that gifted students will literally drop out of advanced classes to avoid the social stigma. They'd rather underperform academically than be labeled as nerds. So let's go back to Will Byers with all of this in mind. Will builds himself a fort in the woods, Castle Byers. It's his refuge, his safe space, and pay attention to when he goes there, when things are too much, when he needs to be alone. This is textbook gifted kid behavior, the intense inner world, the need for a physical space that matches the inner sanctuary, the preference for solitude over shallow social interaction. And look at his friend group, Mike, Dustin, Lucas. They're not exactly the popular kids either. They're outsiders who found each other. This is another pattern you see in gifted populations. They seek out other weirdos, people who might actually understand them. And of course, Will is really into Dungeons and Dragons, like more than the others. In season 3, when Mike and Lucas are starting to move on, Will is the one who's desperately trying to keep the game going. On the surface, this might look like stunted development. Why can't he just grow up? But look at it through the giftedness lens. D&D is an intellectual playground. It's complex, it's creative, it requires strategy, imagination, storytelling, problem solving. For a gifted kid, it's engaging in a way that small talk about crushes just isn't. Will isn't stuck in childhood. He's holding on to the one activity that actually matches his cognitive complexity. So what about emotional overexcitability? Watch Will's physical responses when he's distressed. He doesn't just get sad, his whole body reacts. He gets pale, he freezes. He has what look like psychosomatic responses to emotional stimuli. That's emotional overexcitability right there. And his deep attachment to his friends, his willingness to sacrifice himself for them, that's not just being a good person. That's the kind of profound emotional bonding that gifted kids with high emotional overexcitabilities are known for. Then there's scenes like in season 3, the heartbreaking scene where Will destroys Castle Byers. He's crying. He's saying stupid over and over. He's realizing the world has moved on without him. His friends are changing. He's being left behind. But underneath that, there's a deeper question he's wrestling with. What's the point? If the things I care about don't matter to anyone else, if I have to become someone I'm not to fit in, then what's real? What's worth holding on to? That's existential crisis in a 14-year-old. So here's the thing about Will's character. He's essentially playing the cleric, the support class, when he's actually a wizard, a power class. He creates the art. He has the true sight. He feels the villain coming before anyone else, but he suppresses all of that to prop up Mike and the others. There's a term for this. It's called performative humility. Gifted people often learn that their insights are too much for others, and so they learn to make themselves smaller so they don't threaten the egos of the people around them. Which leads us to the van scene, the most painful scene in season 4. Of course, a lot of people chalk it up to Byler butterflies and maybe some jealousy, but I think there could be an additional layer happening here. The gang is in the van, and Will shows Mike a painting. He gives a beautiful speech about how Mike is the heart of the group. He reassures Mike, builds him up, and tells him exactly what he needs to hear. Then he turns away and sobs into his hand. Why? Because he's lying. Not about Mike being the heart, but about the source of the insight. He says Elle commissioned the painting. So he hides his own emotional depth. He hides his own contribution. He can't claim it as his own work. He can't say, I made this for you because I care about you. This is the performative humility that gifted kids learn. Don't draw attention to your abilities. Don't make yourself vulnerable. Deflect, diminish, disappear. By season 4, Will has gotten really good at hiding. He barely talks about himself. He deflects. He supports others, especially Mike, who, let's be honest, has the emotional awareness of a ham sandwich, while keeping his own feelings buried. He's learned the gifted kid survival strategy. Make yourself small. Be helpful. Don't stand out. Maybe if you're useful enough, people won't notice that you're different. It's devastating to watch because you can see him doing exactly what Coleman and Cross described, engaging in information management, monitoring his social behavior, suppressing his authentic self to maintain relationships. Will is doing all of the emotional calculus for the entire group, and he has to hide it to survive socially. That's not just trauma, that's the specific loneliness of being the only person in the room who understands the assignment. So what do we do with this, besides wanting to give Will a hug and maybe a better barber? Here are some things you can look for in your day-to-day world. First, watch out for the Cassandra complex. In mythology, Cassandra was cursed to see the future but never be believed. If you're the person in your friend group or workplace who always spots the disaster coming 3 months away and everyone calls you negative or anxious, you're not crazy. You're not the one being dramatic. Maybe you're just processing data faster than they are. And next time you're in a meeting and everyone's nodding at something that seems wrong and you're thinking, am I crazy? Maybe you're not. Maybe you're the person who actually ran the numbers. Second, stop apologizing for your overexcitability. If you feel things intensely or you get obsessed with weird topics, that's your hardware. You can't run high-end software on a toaster. Don't try to be a toaster. And those big existential questions keeping you up at night, you're not being overdramatic. You're engaging with real philosophical problems that humanity's been wrestling with for thousands of years. The fact that you can grasp them at age 12 or 15 or 20 doesn't mean you have to have answers yet. And third, find your twinship. This term kind of annoys me, I'll be honest, but psychologist Heinz Kohut talked about the need for twinship, finding people who are like you. Will struggles because he's looking for twinship in Mike, but Mike can't mirror him. Mike is normal. Will needs to find other wizards. Honestly, he should probably just hang out with Erica more. Erica gets it. The social isolation you feel isn't because you're doing something wrong. You're just in an environment that wasn't built for how you think. If you're a parent or teacher, when a gifted kid says they're bored, they're not being bratty. Their brain literally processes information faster and makes connections more quickly. They need more complexity, not more volume. When they choose to be alone instead of socializing, don't assume it's a problem. They might genuinely find their inner world far more interesting than small talk, and that's okay. And for the love of God, don't tell them to just be a kid. They can't. Their brain won't let them. Instead, help them find their people, others who think the way they do. And for everybody, next time you see someone who seems to be underperforming or disengaged, consider that they might be hiding their actual abilities just to fit in. The stigma of giftedness isn't just in their head. It's a real social force that makes smart kids dumb themselves down to survive. And if you catch yourself thinking, I wish I was that smart, maybe also consider what that person might have given up to have that brain. The friendships they couldn't maintain because the conversations felt hollow, the times they felt completely alone in a crowded room, the weight of questions they couldn't stop asking. Intelligence isn't a superpower. It's a different operating system. And like any operating system, it comes with its own bugs and compatibility issues. So I hope I've convinced you that Will Byers isn't just a tragedy because monsters keep eating him. He's a tragedy because he has to shrink his own brilliant, expansive mind to fit into a small town that only wants him to be normal. And I think that might be way scarier than a demigorgon. So that's the story of Will Byers that nobody's quite telling. Yes, he's traumatized. Yes, he's struggling on the romantic front. But he's also a textbook example of a gifted kid navigating a world that doesn't quite make sense to him. And that's been true since before the demigorgon ever showed up. If you found this video interesting, move to the Christmas light that looks like a like button. It really helps us out. Subscribe to Sci vs. Sci for more videos on the psychology behind your favorite shows, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And hey, you can let me know in the comments, in your friend group, are you the wizard, the cleric, or like most of us, do you just alternate between hiding your intelligence and letting your freak flag fly depending on who's in the room? And until next time, keep thinking. Ugh, that haircut though. Okay, I'm ready.